Take a look at a map of Canada, and one thing immediately stands out: a massive chunk missing from the center of the country. That's the Hudson Bay. At first glance, it just looks like a large body of water. But in reality, it's something far stranger. A shallow, frozen inland sea that helped create one of the most powerful corporate empires in history. And even today, it continues to shape the country in ways most people don't realize. Because this isn't just a bay. It's a massive cold engine, one that spreads freezing air across the continent, dramatically affecting where people can actually live. In fact, it plays a major role in why nearly 90% of Canadians live so close to the United States border. So how can a distant, icy bay have that kind of impact on an entire country? And why does it make so much of Canada feel almost unlivable? Welcome to GeoAtlas, and this is the geographic story of the Hudson Bay. To really understand how unusual the Hudson Bay is, you first have to understand its scale. Located in northeastern Canada, it's bordered by Manitoba, Ontario, Quebec, and the Northern Territory of Nunavut. It connects to the Atlantic Ocean through the Hudson Strait and to the Arctic Ocean through the Fox Basin. On paper, it looks like just another large body of water. But in reality, it's massive. Covering more than 1.2 million square kilometers, it's the second largest bay in the world, roughly half the size of the Bay of Bengal. To put that into perspective, you could fit the entire state of Texas inside it and still have enough space left over for California. In every sense, it behaves more like an inland sea than a typical bay. But this is where things start to get strange. Because despite its enormous size, what lies beneath the surface is completely different from what you'd expect. When you think of oceans like the Pacific or the Atlantic, you think of extreme depth, thousands of meters dropping into vast ocean basins. The Hudson Bay is nothing like that. Its average depth is only about 100 meters, which means that compared to the world's oceans, it's incredibly shallow. If the Pacific Ocean is a deep swimming pool, the Hudson Bay is more like a wide, shallow puddle. And that one detail changes everything. Because technically, this isn't even a true ocean basin. It's what geologists call an epicontinental sea, an inland sea that sits directly on top of the continental shelf. In other words, the North American continent doesn't stop at the shoreline. It continues underneath the bay itself. The water is simply filling a broad, shallow depression in the Canadian Shield. But that's only part of the story. Because the water inside the Hudson Bay behaves differently too. If you compared it to water from the Atlantic Ocean, you'd notice a clear difference. The Hudson Bay has much lower salinity, and the reason for that is surprisingly simple. It acts like a giant drain, a massive watershed stretching across millions of square kilometers feeds into it, collecting runoff from as far away as the Rocky Mountains. Rivers like the Churchill, Nelson, and Severn pour enormous amounts of fresh water into the bay every single day. But because the bay is mostly enclosed, with only narrow connections to the ocean, that fresh water doesn't easily flow out. It stays. And over time, it dilutes the salt content of the entire system. And that leads to one of the most important effects of all: ice. Fresh water freezes faster and at higher temperatures than salt water. And because the Hudson Bay is both shallow and less salty, it reacts very quickly to seasonal changes. During the long Canadian winter, the entire 1.2 million square kilometers freezes over completely, turning into a massive sheet of ice that blends into the surrounding tundra. In fact, polar bears use this frozen surface as a hunting platform. Then, during the short summer, it all melts back into open water. This kind of extreme freeze-thaw cycle, on such a massive scale, is incredibly rare, especially at this latitude. Because parts of the Hudson Bay sit at roughly the same latitude as London, England. Yet London experiences mild, rainy winters, while the Hudson Bay becomes a frozen wasteland. And if that wasn't strange enough, the bay is still changing today. It's actually shrinking. During the last ice age, this entire region was buried under the Laurentide ice sheet, miles thick and unimaginably heavy. That weight pushed the Earth's crust downward, forming the shallow basin we see today. But when the ice melted, that pressure disappeared. And now, the land is slowly rising again. This process, known as isostatic rebound, is lifting the crust upward at a rate of about half an inch per year, which means the shoreline is gradually expanding. And the bay itself is slowly retreating. So the Hudson Bay is shallow, fresh, frozen for half the year, and still rising out of the earth. But even that isn't the most surprising part, because somehow this strange frozen inland sea also became the foundation of one of the most powerful corporate empires in human history. And that's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Geologically speaking, the Hudson Bay is actually quite young. Around 10,000 years ago, as the last ice age came to an end, massive glaciers began to retreat and global sea levels started to rise. Eventually, ocean water flooded the vast depression left behind by the ice forming the bay we see today. But despite its harsh conditions, this region has never been truly empty. For thousands of years, indigenous peoples lived along its shores, most notably the Inuit in the north and the Cree and Dene further south. And for them, the Hudson Bay wasn't a frozen wasteland. It was a resource, a living, shifting environment that provided everything they needed to survive. In fact, they didn't just adapt to the extreme conditions. They mastered them. During the summer months, they traveled across open waters, hunting beluga whales and seals. And when winter arrived, the frozen bay transformed completely. What looked like an obstacle became an advantage. The ice turned into a vast, flat highway. Using dog sleds, they could travel incredible distances, tracking polar bears and following migrating caribou along the frozen coastline. It was a system perfectly adapted to one of the harshest environments on Earth. But for outsiders, it was a trap. When the first Europeans arrived in the early 1600s, they had no understanding of what they were dealing with. At the time, European powers were obsessed with finding the Northwest Passage, a shortcut through North America that would connect them directly to the markets of Asia. So in 1610, the English explorer Henry Hudson sailed his ship Discovery through an ice-filled strait and suddenly entered a massive open body of water. Hudson believed he had done it. Standing on the deck, looking out across the horizon, he thought he had reached the Pacific Ocean. He hadn't. He had just sailed into the bay that would eventually bear his name. For months, Hudson explored the coastline, pushing further south, searching for an exit that didn't exist. And then winter arrived. The shallow, low salinity water froze rapidly, trapping the Discovery in solid ice. The crew was forced to survive on land through one of the harshest winters imaginable, facing starvation, disease, and freezing temperatures. When spring finally came and the ice began to melt, Hudson wanted to continue the journey, but his crew had reached their limit. In one of the most infamous mutinies in exploration history, they turned against him. Hudson, his teenage son, and 7 loyal crew members were forced into a small open boat and abandoned in the vast bay. They were never seen again. You might expect that a place this dangerous would be avoided forever. But just a few decades later, it became the center of something much bigger. By the mid-1600s, Europe was experiencing a massive fashion boom beaver felt hats. The demand was enormous, and the cold forests of Canada produced the finest pelts in the world. At the time, French traders controlled most of the fur trade. But their system was slow and difficult transporting goods across rivers, lakes, and land for thousands of miles. Then 2 French explorers, Radisson and Groseilliers, realized something that changed everything. The Hudson Bay sits at the bottom of an enormous watershed, which means countless rivers naturally flow into it from across central Canada. Instead of moving inland, you could sail directly into the bay, anchor near the river mouths, trade with indigenous communities, and return to Europe far more efficiently. It was a geographic shortcut unlike anything else. When the French crown rejected their idea, they turned to England. And this time, it worked. In 1670, King Charles II granted a royal charter, but not just permission to trade. He granted control over the entire Hudson Bay watershed, a region known as Rupert's Land, covering around 1.5 million square miles, nearly a third of modern-day Canada, extending into parts of what is now the United States. And with that, the Hudson's Bay Company was born. What followed was unlike anything seen before. Fortified trading posts were built along the bay places like York Factory and Fort Churchill. The company operated almost like its own country, issuing currency, enforcing rules, and controlling trade across an entire continent. It became one of the most powerful corporate empires in history. And incredibly, it still exists today as a major retail chain, making it the oldest incorporated joint stock merchandising company in the English-speaking world. In many ways, the Hudson Bay didn't just influence Canada's economy, it helped shape the map itself. But despite all of this history and wealth, the Bay has never been an easy place to live near. Because even today, it continues to act as a powerful force that shapes Canada's climate and limits where people can actually live. And that's where the real impact begins. Normally, large bodies of water make life easier. They absorb heat during the summer and slowly release it during the winter. That's why coastal regions around the world tend to have milder climates than areas deep inland. You can see this clearly in Europe. Thanks to the warm Gulf Stream, people are able to live comfortably at surprisingly high latitudes. But the Hudson Bay doesn't follow those rules. Instead of warming the land around it, it does the exact opposite. It cools it. Because every winter, the bay freezes over completely. And once that happens, it loses its ability to store and release heat. So when the freezing winds of the polar vortex move south from the Arctic, they don't pass over warm water. They move across a flat, frozen surface stretching over 1.2 million square kilometers, uninterrupted, which allows those winds to stay cold and move faster. The Hudson Bay essentially becomes a giant conveyor belt for Arctic air, pulling extreme cold deep into the heart of Canada. It pushes the permafrost line further south, expanding regions where the ground remains permanently frozen. And this creates one of the strangest population patterns on Earth. Canada is the second largest country in the world, covering nearly 10 million square kilometers. But if you look at where people actually live, that size becomes almost meaningless. Around 90% of the country's 40 million people live within just 160 kilometers of the United States border, forming a long, narrow band of settlement along the southern edge. And the reason is surprisingly simple. The Hudson Bay removes a huge portion of the country from being easily livable. Between the physical gap it creates, the rocky terrain of the Canadian Shield, and the extreme cold it generates, large-scale cities and agriculture become incredibly difficult across central Canada. So instead of spreading out, the population is pushed south, compressed into a thin strip of habitable land. Almost like Chile, long, narrow, and tightly packed. But here's the strange part. If the Hudson Bay makes so much of the country harder to live in, why does it still matter so much? Because despite being hostile to human settlement, it's incredibly valuable. The massive river systems flowing into the bay carry enormous energy potential. In provinces like Quebec and Manitoba, huge hydroelectric projects such as the La Grande complex capture that energy, turning flowing water into electricity on a massive scale, enough to power major cities like Montreal and Winnipeg, and even export surplus energy to the United States. But that's not all. The same geological forces that shaped the bay also exposed valuable natural resources. Regions around the bay are rich in nickel, copper, zinc, and even diamonds, contributing billions to Canada's economy. And now, a new chapter may be beginning. As global temperatures rise, the Hudson Bay is changing again. ice forms later and melts earlier, opening shipping routes that were once impossible to use. The port of Churchill, Manitoba, Canada's only deep-water Arctic port, could become a key gateway for future trade, transforming the bay from a frozen barrier into a strategic advantage. So in the end, the Hudson Bay is more than just a massive gap on the map. It's a force that shapes climate, controls population, and quietly powers an entire country. It limits where people can live, while at the same time creating opportunities they depend on. And maybe that's what makes it so fascinating. Because sometimes the places that seem empty are actually the ones shaping everything around them.